The wind that swept through Hamelin that fateful evening carried with it a peculiar unease, a chill that clung not to the skin but to the soul. I write now, not in the hope of resolution, but to etch into words the dreadful echoes that still reverberate through my mind. Perhaps you will understand. Perhaps you will judge. Either way, you must listen. It began in the twilight hours of 1284, as the town square bustled with the remnants of day's commerce. The air was heavy with the scent of baked bread and the earthy tang of rain-soaked cobblestones. I stood near the fountain, its worn statue of St. Nicholas gazing forlornly at the sky. The townsfolk whispered of our plight, a plague of rats, a seething tide that devoured grain, chewed through walls, and spread disease like wildfire. The council had promised salvation, but their coffers, much like their promises, were empty. Then he came, a man of striking peculiarity, clad in garments of vivid reds and greens that seemed to shimmer with every step. His face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but his eyes, when they caught the torchlight, burned with an intensity that made my breath hitch. In his hand, he carried a flute, long and slender, carved from a wood so dark it seemed to drink the light around it. He spoke little, his voice smooth yet unsettlingly hollow, as though the words were not truly his own. "I can rid you of your vermin," he said, "but my price is steep." The mayor, a rotund man with a voice as loud as his greed, balked at the stranger's demand for gold. But desperation breeds poor judgment. A bargain was struck. The man would play his flute and banish the rats, and in return, he would receive a sum that could have fed the town through a winter. We gathered at the square that night, torches flickering in the growing dark. The stranger raised the flute to his lips and began to play. The melody was unlike anything I had ever heard, sweet yet dissonant, alluring yet discordant. It snaked through the streets like an invisible mist, wrapping around every corner, seeping into every crevice. The rats came from cellars, from gutters, from the shadows where they festered. They poured forth in a writhing, squealing mass. They followed him as though entranced, their beady eyes fixed on the source of the music. The townsfolk watched in silence, their faces pale with a mixture of awe and dread. He led them to the river. I followed, compelled by something I cannot name. As the moon cast its silver light upon the water, he played a final note, long and mournful. The rats surged forward, plunging into the depths until not a single one remained. The town was saved, or so we thought. When the stranger returned to the square, the mayor met him with a smug grin and a bag of copper coins. "This is all we can spare," he said. The man's smile did not falter, but something in his eyes changed. A flicker of shadow, a glint of something that made my stomach churn. He said nothing, only turned and walked away, his flute tucked under his arm. That night, the children vanished. Every crib, every bed, every nook where a child should have lain was empty. The streets echoed with the wails of mothers and the frantic shouts of fathers. Among them was my sister, Anna, her cheeks streaked with tears as she searched for her son, Ansel. He was but 6 years old, with a laugh that could brighten even the gloomiest of days. I could not bear her grief, nor could I stand idle. Torch in hand, I set out, my resolve fueled by desperation. Near the forest's edge, I heard it again, a faint, haunting melody drifting through the trees. My heart hammered as I followed the sound, each note wrapping around me like a noose. The path was treacherous, the ground slick with moss and mud, but I pressed on, my breath catching at the sight ahead. The children, a procession of them, their faces blank as though caught in a waking dream, their small feet moving in rhythm to the unholy tune. At their head was the man, his flute raised, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Answer!" I screamed, my voice raw with anguish. For a moment, he turned. His small hand reached out, his lips trembling as though to speak, but the music swelled, drowning out all else. The flautist's gaze met mine, and in it I saw a void so deep it seemed to pull the world into its abyss. I lunged forward, desperate to seize him, to stop whatever horror was unfolding, but my legs faltered as the air grew thick, suffocating. The children disappeared into a cavernous opening at the base of a hill, a place I swear had not existed the day before. The music ceased, and with it, my strength. I collapsed to my knees, the darkness swallowing the last flicker of my torch. I crawled toward the opening, my fingers scraping against the cold, unyielding stone. "Ansel!" I called again, my voice echoing into the abyss. Then I felt it, a hand, small and trembling, gripping mine. Relief flooded me as I turned to see him, but his eyes, oh God, his eyes, they were no longer his. They stared past me, empty, unseeing. A voice, low, melodic, and inhuman, whispered from the shadows. "Do you wish to join them?" I recoiled, pulling Ansel to me, but his form dissolved like mist, leaving only the chill of the night. The opening sealed itself as if it had never been, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. Now, as I sit in this empty room, the faint strains of a flute reach my ears once more. It is distant yet unmistakable, a melody that coils around my thoughts, pulling me toward the window. My hand trembles as I write these final words, the music growing louder, closer. Do you hear it? Oh, tell me, do you hear it too?
I've always believed the ocean hides more than it reveals. What I experienced near Palmyra Atoll shattered every boundary between belief and terror. I can't say for sure if I'm recounting this to warn you or to free myself from the weight of it. Either way, listen closely. We were four aboard the Elysium, a sleek yacht Lucas had rented to rekindle old bonds. We were supposed to be friends, but the truth was messier. Lucas, the fearless captain, was obsessed with control, masking his insecurities with bravado. Mara, his girlfriend, lived through the lens of her camera, always hunting for content to boost her online presence. Ben was the glue that held us together, or tried to, though his patience was frayed after years of mediating between Lucas and me. And then there was me, the reluctant participant, dragged along because I owed Ben a favor too big to refuse. Tension crackled like static between us from the moment we set sail. Lucas barked orders with the arrogance of someone who believed he was invincible. Mara filmed everything, her comments sharp and cutting. Ben, ever the peacekeeper, tried to smooth things over, but even he couldn't mask his irritation. On the third night, as the sky bruised with twilight, the mood darkened further. "Do you even know where we're going, Lucas?" I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "Relax," Lucas shot back, his grin not quite reaching his eyes. "It's called exploring. You should try it." "Exploring? Is that what you call drifting aimlessly in cursed waters?" I snapped. Mara's eyes lit up, her camera trained on me. Oh, this should be good. Tell us, what's the big spooky story? Palmyra's not a story, Ben interjected, his voice low. People vanish here. Ships disappear. There's a reason they call it haunted. Lucas laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. Haunted? Please. It's just an island. Before Ben could respond, Mara gasped. Look. We turned to see it. A ship, barely visible against the horizon, its silhouette warped and otherworldly. Is that even real? I whispered. It's a ship, Lucas said, already adjusting course. And we're checking it out. You're insane, Ben exclaimed, grabbing his arm. Do you know what happens to people who mess with things out here? Lucas shook him off. Grow up, Ben. It's probably just a wreck. Maybe there's salvage. No one's salvaging anything from that, I muttered. But my protest was drowned out by the haunting sound that followed. A melody, soft and lilting, carried on the wind. Do you hear that? Mara asked, lowering her camera for once. The flute's melody was both enchanting and deeply wrong, pulling at something primal inside me. We docked beside the ship, its name faintly visible, the Piper's Call. The sight of it froze my blood. Lucas, don't do this, I said, my voice shaking. Stay here if you're scared, he sneered. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay back, I followed. The deck of the Piper's Call creaked beneath our weight, slick with algae and brine. Mara filmed everything, her lens lingering on grotesque carvings etched into the wood. Figures dancing, their faces contorted with joy and agony. This is insane, Ben muttered. We need to leave. But Lucas had already spotted the stairs leading below deck. Come on. Let's see what's down there. Reluctantly, we descended, the air thickening with each step. The flute's melody grew louder, its notes twisting and discordant. In the hold, we found them. Figures carved from wood, life-sized and unnervingly realistic. Men, women, and children, frozen middens, their faces locked in expressions of ecstasy and despair. What the? Ben began, but his words died in his throat as Mara stepped closer. Don't touch anything, I hissed, but she was transfixed by a figure holding a flute. Lucas, this is incredible, she said, her voice trembling. Yeah, Lucas replied, though he sounded far from certain. Then the music stopped. The silence was deafening. My skin prickled as the wooden figures seemed to shift in the flickering lantern light. Let's go, Ben urged, his voice taut with panic. But the stairs we had descended were gone. Lucas, I whispered, my throat tightening. Where's the exit? He turned, his face pale. It was right there. Suddenly, Mara screamed. The flautist's head had turned, its empty eyes locked onto her. Run, I shouted, though I had no idea where to go. We stumbled through the darkness, the wooden figures closing in, their twisted faces illuminated by flashes of Mara's camera. The flute's melody returned, now a cacophony of chaos, drowning out our shouts. I don't know how I made it back to the Elysium. I only know that when I emerged on deck, I was alone. Lucas, Mara, Ben, they were gone. But the Piper's Call remained, its shadow looming over me as the melody reached its crescendo. Then I saw it. Mara's camera lying on the deck, its screen cracked but flickering. I picked it up with trembling hands, hitting play. The recording showed Mara filming the flautist as Lucas tried to pull her away. Then, without warning, the wooden figures moved, grabbing, twisting, pulling them into their macabre dance. The final frame showed the flautist's face, now smiling. And then I heard it. Footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, the camera slipping from my grasp. And then, everything went black.
It was in Brittany, among the rugged coasts and shadow-draped hamlets of France, that I found myself entangled in the accursed tale I now recount. The year escapes me, as does the clarity of memory, for the events have gnawed at my sanity like a moth at fabric. Even now I shudder as I pen these words, feeling the oppressive weight of unseen eyes upon me. The village of Morlaix, nestled between cliffs that seemed to writhe under the tempestuous skies, was my refuge. Or so I thought. I had come seeking solitude, a respite from the relentless tumult of my life. A stranger to the townsfolk, I rented a room above the inn, its walls adorned with fading tapestries and a single, stoic portrait of a man whose eyes seemed to follow my every movement. It was there, over mugs of cider and the mournful wail of the wind, that I first heard whispers of the Lord of Kergrist Castle. They spoke of him in hushed tones, a nobleman of immense wealth and inscrutable habits. "Blue beard," they murmured, their faces pale with fear. His name alone was enough to silence the room. He was said to have taken many wives, though none were seen again after crossing the castle's threshold. "The devil walks with him," an old woman rasped, clutching her rosary. Fool that I was, I scoffed at their superstition. What could a man's misdeeds, however dark, mean to me? Yet, as the days stretched into weeks, my curiosity festered like a wound. The castle loomed on the horizon, its silhouette jagged against the twilight. Each evening, as I gazed out from my small room, I swore I saw lights flicker within its forlorn towers. The locals avoided even its shadow, but I felt an inexplicable pull, as though the stones themselves called to me. One fateful evening, emboldened by drink and my own restless spirit, I resolved to visit Kergrist Castle. I told myself it was mere curiosity, a desire to glimpse the life of this enigmatic figure. But deep down, I suspect I sought something darker, though I dared not name it. The path to the castle was a winding serpent of cobblestones, flanked by ancient oaks that seemed to whisper among themselves. The air grew colder with each step, as if the world itself recoiled from my journey. The castle gates, wrought iron and ominous, groaned open at my touch, as though they were breathing their first breath in centuries. Beyond lay a courtyard bathed in eerie stillness, save for the rustling of ivy and the occasional hoot of an owl. Each stone seemed to exhale a faint chill that crept beneath my skin. I hesitated, my courage faltering, when the voice, deep, resonant, and unyielding, pierced the silence. "Enter, traveler." The great hall was no mere room, but a cathedral of dread. Chandeliers dripped with wax, their flames casting flickering shadows upon walls lined with portraits. Each face was a study in melancholy, their eyes wide with a terror that seemed to pierce the veil of time. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its banister carved with serpentine figures whose eyes gleamed as though alive. The Lord himself awaited me by the hearth, his beard as dark as midnight, and his gaze as piercing as a blade. "Welcome," he intoned, his voice both a greeting and a command. Our conversation was cordial, yet laden with an undercurrent of unease. He spoke of philosophy, of the folly of mankind, and of the transient nature of beauty. His words were mesmerizing, but his eyes, oh, his eyes, they held a depth that seemed to draw me in, as if they harbored secrets too ghastly to bear. It was then that he made his offer. "Stay the night," he said, pouring a goblet of wine as dark as blood. "Explore the castle at your leisure. All doors are open to you, save one." A cold dread gripped me, and if I should open it, I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to appear unshaken. He smiled, a chilling curve of the lips, and said, "Then you shall see what must never be seen." That night, plagued by restless thoughts, I roamed the castle's labyrinthine halls. Each room seemed to echo with whispers, faint and unintelligible, as though the walls themselves conspired to unnerve me. I wandered through a library, its shelves bowing under the weight of ancient tomes whose spines bore symbols I dared not interpret. A gallery followed, where paintings of women, each hauntingly beautiful, adorned the walls, their gazes fixed on me with an almost accusatory intensity. I found myself in a music room, where a harpsichord stood silent, its keys dusted but unbroken. When my fingers brushed against the ivory, a dissonant chord rang out, reverberating through the air like a lamentation. The sound unsettled me so deeply that I fled the room, my candle casting wild shadows along the corridors. At last I stood before the forbidden door. It was unremarkable, its wood plain and unadorned, yet it exuded an aura of foreboding that made the very air heavy. My hand trembled as I turned the key, which seemed to burn against my palm. The door creaked open with a groan that echoed like a dirge. Inside, my candle illuminated a scene that will haunt me to my grave. The room was vast, its floor slick with a crimson sheen that needed no explanation. Suspended from the rafters, their forms grotesquely preserved, were the bodies of women. Their faces were pale, their eyes vacant, yet their expressions seemed frozen in the agony of their final moments. The air was suffocating, thick with the metallic tang of blood, and a faint cloying sweetness that turned my stomach. As I stepped closer, my mind pieced together the fragments of the ghastly tableau. Their attire, tattered and stained, bore the intricate patterns of bridal gowns. Rings adorned their withered fingers, some bearing initials etched with trembling hands. I staggered backward, a realization clawing at my sanity. These were his wives, the countless women who had vanished without a trace. Each face, though lifeless, seemed to accuse me, their vacant eyes burning into my soul. A noise behind me, a whisper, a shuffle. I turned, but the door was gone. The walls seemed to close in, the figures in the room twisting and writhing, as if animated by some malevolent force. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stumbled backward, my mind screaming for escape. The sweet, sickly aroma grew overwhelming, and I felt as though the room itself sought to consume me. Then his voice, that dreadful voice, filled the room. You wish to know my secret, and now it is yours to bear. I awoke in my room above the inn, the morning light streaming through the window. Had it all been a dream? My hands trembled as I dressed, my mind a storm of confusion. Yet as I reached for my coat, a small object tumbled from its pocket, a key, tarnished and cold. The villagers found me days later, wandering the cliffs, muttering incoherently. I have tried to rid myself of the key, but it always returns. The castle stands as it always has, a sentinel of dread against the horizon. I dare not approach it again, yet I feel its pull, relentless and consuming.